Yeah. That won't make a difference. All right. I just have to make sure that this. Yeah. That won't. All right. Good morning. Good morning. Yeah, it's all right. We sorry we missed you. We added all of the names, all of your friends' names onto the Mr. Barrett list. Good morning. We get to leap right in. I actually do spend a lot of time thinking about like what to study and what to do. Last year we took a swing at doing Israel issues, but having solved those, welcome back. I know, Alan, you're just recently back, and everyone should be paying attention. There are elections on next week. So we'll talk about that at the end or something like that. We can dive in here. The idea of this is we've spent some time doing over the course of the years doing Nevi'im, doing the narrative parts of the Bible after the Torah. So here we'll go to the Torah itself and do a sort of like deep dive into it and turn it over for everything is in it. Not Parshat HaShavua, because that has its strengths and weaknesses. And the weaknesses is that if you do the weekly portion, you spend 1 week on the creation stories in Genesis and in an equal amount of time or a greater amount of time on skin diseases in Leviticus. And fascinating though those may be, and though they may be equally from Mount Sinai, really a deep dive into Genesis is endlessly fascinating and valuable. So, pause. Questions before I go any further? My idea is, one, to read as we do in other things, line by line, word by word. 2, to maintain multiple perspectives at once. This is the trick, which is to say, the trick is to be able to understand this historically, which is why are they saying this from a historical perspective? Critically, which is to say, how did this text come into being to be what it is now? And also from a Torah perspective, meaning what makes this Torah? This isn't Aesop's fables. This isn't this isn't Shakespeare. We're not looking at this just to understand how it came into being, or for the sake of reading historically significant literature. We're reading it for Torah, which is that this is step 1 in our guide to life, and an understanding of, well, I would give you there's sort of different options on it. I would say the main framework is some understand this text as coming from God. And I think it's worth looking at it through that lens. Or at the very least, looking at it as the way that we reach to God. So whether this is God talking to us or us talking to God, either way, this is somewhere in that conversation. So if you don't find yourself in column A, look at it from the perspective of column B, and that's always valuable. I mean that we're supposed to try and get some guidance out of this, or some insight into this, sense of wisdom on how to live our lives. Does this make sense? So all of those at once. And not just that, but also the Torah. It's one thing you can read, the stories of King David and things like that. A lot of those you can sort of read straight through, and there's a little bit of the midrashic read on it, which is the straight text is David's something of a rascal, and the midrashic read on it is David is a saint. But those were sort of easy to hold those both at the same time. With this, especially with Beresheet, there's much more going on. And again, as I may have said before, part of the trick of doing this and what you have to do is, and this is the right age audience, this is like Act on the Ed Sullivan Show, where the person would come in and they're spinning plates on top of broomsticks, right? And and the trick is to like keep all the plates spinning on top of broomsticks, and like you got to, when you get this one, you got to go over to this one because you forgot about it over there, and you got to keep running around, keeping them all spinning. That's what you have to do to read the text, which is to say, read it historically, like what society produced this. Read it religiously. That's the God part of it. Like, what wisdom do we get out of this to like give to bring guidance and balance and insight into our lives? To read it midrashically, which is, I can see what's in the text, but I see how the tradition, how the sages, the rabbis, like put words in between the words here to fill in the blanks in the text at once. So both the literal meaning and the midrashic meaning. So all those plates you got to keep spinning, and that's part of why it's going to take a long time to get through any of it. But that's what makes it fun and rich and deep. Yes.
Is that a literal reading of the Bible with what told everything, or is it more like if I recall, not in France, not in this years ago, about talking about reading is more like the concept of the book.
So I'm going to summarize your question for the people online because I said I would. So, like, what's the instructionist read of the text? So every group has like multiple readings, but like then to speak broadly, like a reconstructionist read of the text, I think is in line with, this is us speaking to God, as it were. But God isn't a anthropomorphic being in the sky. God is, in classical Kaplanianism, is the force that makes for salvation in the universe, right? So it's not a cognizant being, as it were, but rather sort of something else. But anything reconstructionist in a way is certainly theologically is also present in the conservative movement as well. I mean, there's nothing, partly because, again, Mordechai Kaplan, founder of Reconstructionism, teaches 50 years at JTS in New York and puts his stamp on, the not just 50 years worth of conservative rabbis, but when the movement was in its prime, right? Sort of like, this is the so you find it in the conservative movement as well, in guys like Harold Schulweiss or Eddie Feinstein or on down. Like, it's not, I think, to a degree, to a not insignificant degree, in the theology of Rabbi Ron Isaacs as well. You find that. So yeah. So I mean, if you think about it, look, from a standard issue public, at least Orthodox perspective, like this, every word comes from God. And most non-Orthodox Jews don't have like that active of theology to have like God taking dictation. What I'm saying is partly like, even though odds are you don't have that perspective, and odds are I don't have that perspective, treating it that way is part of how we access an extra level of the text. And this is, to a certain degree, like crying during a movie. All the stuff on the screen is just actors, and they're reading off a script, and they're not even in the room, and this was recorded years ago or whatever it might be, and they're playing pretend anyway. But you also are emotionally and intellectually intelligent enough to let yourself get lights go down, and you get swept away with the story, and you go along with it. And by the time the Titanic goes down, you're crying because you've let yourself like sort of like get emotionally involved in the story and to take what it's giving you, even though intellectually you know, like, well, this like sort of isn't a literal thing that happened, and this was done in a studio, and it's not real, but you let yourself get swept away because otherwise you don't get movies or plays or anything. So this. Treat it at least like this. Jews often have a hard time, non-Orthodox American Jews often have a hard time getting to that point and like knowing that, oh, I can treat the Torah with the same level of seriousness I treat a movie. Like we're on our guard because we don't want to become religious freaks. But no danger. Don't worry about it. It'll be okay. Yeah. Pause. All right. So so all those levels at once. So like any question you have, like sort of like we'll deal with. Now questions? I'll keep going. Translations. People ask me what to bring. The answer is whatever you like. You can bring anything you want. You know, the standard Jewish translation is the JPS translation from the 60s, from the 1960s, that was sort of like came into its current form in 1985 or so, and it's known as the New Jewish Publication Society translation. The old one is 1917. That one has the these and thous and what's dist, thou shalt and things like this. The 1960s era translation got, put it into modern English rather than fake Elizabethan English. And you can get that in here, and it's nice. So that's one that you find in, the JPS Tanakh, this blue book that most homes have. And if you don't have it, we got 100 of them here. It's the same translation that's in the Jewish Study Bible that some of you use. The advantage of each of these is that there's commentary along the way. You can't read the Torah alone. It makes no sense if you just read it straightforward. You have to have some commentary to explain what's going on along the way. Both of these are the same JPS translation. It's nice. It has some shortcomings, which is Robert Alter, in his introduction to his translation of the Torah, which is on Alan's lap over here, like has a he doesn't name it, but he clearly attacks the JPS translation because he has to justify why he's translating. And JPS, like most modern translations, explains the text to you rather than leaving the mysterious parts mysterious and leaving the weird parts weird. There's lots of weird parts, especially in Genesis. And JPS sometimes will make it, and it's the same with the modern Protestant and Catholic translations into English. Like they sort of make it so that the reader can look at it and be like, oh, I see what's going on. Which is nice if you're reading it through. But if you're studying it and you want to know, like, what is this actually saying, that it simplifies too much. It's like the news story that sort of like, that gives you what to think about this. So JPS, along with the rest, sort of like pick an explanation and give it to you. And the explanation might be a correct one, but it's one when there might be 5 different options out there. And if you left the text, if you left it in a more straight translation, the different options might be open to you. So it'd be slower reading, but you'd see that there's something weird going on here. Does that make sense? So JPS sort of smooths things over, which makes it easy to read, but not always ideal for study. Which is why. So I'm going to throw out 100 different books here. You can pick one to read from if you want. You can take mine if you want. Can't take this one, but it's good. The JPS, the Jewish Publication Society out of Philadelphia, in recent years translated the Mikrot Gedolot, which they call the Commentator's Bible, which is the sort of classical medieval way of reading the Torah, that you read it with commentaries. So they did a great job here. They laid it out like a Talmud, like a page of Talmud with the text and the commentary surrounding it. And they translate, there's a guy, I think he might even be at Indiana, Michael Karasik. Oh no, he's in Philadelphia. He taught in India, but he's in Philadelphia now. The translated Rashi and Ibn Ezra and Nachmanides and a number of other commentators, translated them into English and put them all together on this page. So, and he included the new JPS translation and the old one from 1917 because they don't always agree. So he can like have, so he'll like sort of paraphrase Rashi as Rashi saying that new JPS sort of misses this, but the old translation gets it right, or vice versa. So this is a good one because it has like all of the Rashi in it. Art School also has a good Rashi translation. They'll sell it volume by volume. So this is Art School's translation. Art School translates differently than JPS does. Art School translates according to Rashi. Rashi, the great French commentator from 1,000 years ago. So they openly in their introduction, like, we're not like, whenever the text is unclear, we're going to tell you, we're going to translate it according to what Rashi says it means. So Rashi doesn't always, may or may not be right, because, in this book, you'll see that other commentators, including Rashi's grandson, Rashbam, Rabbi Shimon ben Meir, disagrees with Rashi, and occasionally will be like, Rashi's wrong. But Art School is like, nope, Rashi is always right, and we're translating according to him. So it's a different translation. So if somebody has like the Art School translation with them, you'll see like sort of like, oh, like this is not the same as what JPS says. It's sometimes just different. I'm going to keep going with different translations because this is part of the point of today and why I have a pile of books here. Everett Fox, who was at Clark University in Worcester, also has a fascinating translation that you can pick up called The Five Books of Moses. This is from the mid-1990s. And he translates the Hebrew according to the rhythm of the Hebrew. So it doesn't read like normal English. It's sort of like an English version of the Hebrew. And he does this because Martin Buber and Franz Rosenzweig, great German Jewish scholars of the early 20th century, Buber, among other things, famously sort of translated Hasidic stories and eventually was driven out of Germany by Hitler and ended up in teaching at Hebrew U in Free State Palestine. The Rosenzweig and Buber translated the Torah into German with the same style, like trying to get in German the flavor of the Hebrew. So Fox sort of does that. He's doing it, Buber and Rosenzweig, their German translation style into English. So so the sentence structure is different. It reflects Hebrew sentence structure rather than English sentence structure. And he leaves the names, as it were, usually untranslated. But we'll, instead of Joseph, it'll be Yosef, and he'll explain. They'll always say, "Oh, I'm happy to have another child, so she named him Joseph." And in English, it doesn't make any sense. But he'll translate like, "I'll name him Yosef, that it will increase." Or she was thankful, so she named her son Judah. What does that have to do with anything? Oh, thankful, she named Yehuda, which means I will thank. So Fox is good. I enjoy the Fox translation because it gives the flavor of the Hebrew, though as Alter says, it sort of like isn't really English, even though every word is English. One more or two more. Richard Elliott Friedman, also from the late 90s, a good translation and commentary. He's a scholar, was at UCSD and now at Emory, is a one of the preeminent biblical scholars of critical theory of like this generation. And he translated anew and put in a commentary on it. And the translation is good. It's clear English, and he tries to be close to the text. And whenever there's sort of like something that stumps him, he footnotes it and says, this could be this, it could be that. I chose this for this reason. Robert Alter, whose translation we used before, does the same. Obviously, he tries to translate according to the Hebrew, leaves the weird parts weird, and like and leaves a footnote for like, I could go this way or that. I chose this for this reason, but you can make a good argument that I could have translated that way. So if we have different translations of the room, then you can be like, we can do this. Well, mine says X, and that's good. Yeah, and we've done that in the past. The same actually, Alter, because says that this in his introduction to his translation of the Torah, says that King James remained maybe the best translation into English, even though it's not that good a translation. Because he says the modern translations have an advantage because we know more about linguistics now than they did when they did the King James translation in the early 1600s, right? And so in the 1600s, they didn't have the same level of information on Semitic languages. And we have many more resources and many more ancient sources than they did. So we can compare ancient texts that they couldn't get their hands on because, back in the day, you were limited to what was on the shelf in your library. Now, every shelf on every library is in front of me, right? So like we've got we have a lot more resources that they couldn't have had. He's like, but King James left the weird parts weird. Again, like didn't try to explain everything the way modern translators do. He's like, so like that. And obviously there's a poetic aspect to it. Every English translation lives in the shadow of King James because the poeticness in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was unformed and void, and the darkness hovered over the deep, and things like that. Like this, or the poeticness of King James is obviously unmatched. So,
what's the title of Alter's book?
Alters is the 5 books of Moses. And you can get it. The paperback version is what Alan Rubin has. Hold it up for everyone to see. So I've got a version of that at home. Then I bought like his complete set, which looks like this. That one prints a little bigger, FYI, than in this one, but the words are the same. But they're all good. I like Richard Elliott Friedman. I like Everett Fox, as I say, and some of these are also, we have copies in the library here, and part of it is like because every week we read out of the JPS translation out of the Eitz Chaim, like to me, like gets a little boring after a while. So I just sort of like I like the different perspectives because I spend time with this one every week anyway. Make sense? Every translator obviously has their own perspective, does their own thing with it. There's since you mentioned the Reform Chumash also is worth getting. Partly, it's like the updated Unter Plaut edition. They remove gendered appellations for God. So they translate without all of the lords and things like that. So they'll translate Lord as the eternal, and sort of like and avoid all the he's and things like that. So if you're looking for that, and it has its own commentary along with it. So if you're looking for something like that, This is the Torah. That you find in many Reform synagogues. Yeah. So that, which brings us to names for God. So pause. Translations, anyone? Good. So names for God. God, it has a couple of different names that are important to know, especially as you're looking in the book of Genesis. The most common name for God in the Tanakh is Yod-He Vav-He, right? Like that's a name that in Shul we pronounce Adonai, which is Hebrew for like my Lord, my Lord's really. And Adonai like is a word with that is a substitute for the name of God, which we tend not to say. So Art School will translate that word as Hashem, the name. JPS, in the Eitz Chaim or wherever, will translate it as the Lord, with Lord in capital letters, right? All caps. The gender neutral modern Reform translation will translate as the eternal. Richard Elliott Friedman, wanting to avoid the issue, translates it capital YHVH. So it remains, which is cool because it remains unpronounceable, which sort of like captures a little something, but it's hard to read because it remains unpronounceable, right? Like it's like the symbol for the artist formerly known as Prince of blessed memory. Like you can't pronounce it. So there's an advantage that it captures something that's in the Hebrew text, but you then can't say it. The altar leaves it as Lord. And what does Everett Fox do? I think he also does. Yeah, he also leaves as YHWH. In ancient Hebrew, many scholars think, or the consensus is that the Vav in ancient Hebrew had a W, not quite all the way to a V, not all the way to a W, but somewhere in between that, but leaning towards a W. I may have mentioned past, like when I was in Hamilton, Ontario, our Torah reader, Victor Abraham, great guy, Renaissance man, was born in Bombay, and he had his day school in Bombay back in the day, taught him a proper Vav, which was a way to bear. It's like it's hard for me to say, but anyway. So that some scholars will say what they think the pronunciation is of that. So you'll see that in most scholarly works where they'll spell out YAHWEH. I'm not convinced that the way people pronounce that is accurate, and it definitely isn't part of the Jewish religious tradition. So I'm not offended when others do. You gotta do worse than that to offend me. But I don't. So I like going with Adonai as the proper way to do it, but like any of the options out there are fine. I tend to avoid masculine pronouns for God, but like it's not a big deal. I like say God's pronouns are God. But it's okay if it's pretty clear in the text, in the Torah text, that God's gender identity is he, his. God's pronouns in the Torah are in fact he, his, and it's like easier to read with that. But and I think that that in the time of the Torah, they 100% conceived of God as masculine, as it were. The later tradition will see God as being without body and without gender. And in the Kabbalah, there'll be heavy influence of thinking of feminine aspects of God. But in the original, I think that they did see God as masculine, and I think it'd be hard to mount a counter argument.
Rabbi?
Yes.
Sometimes when you're reading from the Torah, the scroll itself, like at Minyan or something, you've pointed out to us that a scribe who was writing the words may have added a little mark or something like this. So the implication is that every scribe, every Torah in every synagogue may actually have slightly different words in them or something like that.
No. So the short answer. So there are those dots are in. So there are a number of words in the Torah that have dots above them, but those dots are you're correct. The first half is correct. Are there that the scribe puts them in, but the scribe doesn't put them in on his or her own the decision-making process. Those are fixed in the tradition. So you'll notice in if you're reading along in a Hebrew text, it's in the Eitz Chaim or in any edition of JPS that has a Hebrew, or in the Art Scroll or whatever it might be. They'll have and sometimes in English translations, that it will always say there'll be what's called a Masoretic note. In the Hebrew, there are dots above these letters. So that does happen, and the scribe does put those in, but not but at fixed points in the text, not at any random point in the text. There may be one point way back when where there was an original person doing that, but that's well lost to history as to how those started out. But but those traditions are fixed. So every Torah is in fact supposed to look the same, same letters and same dots in the same places. And that is in fact, in my experience, accurate, meaning that every Torah is in fact the same. The dots are in the same places. Sometimes the dots are sort of like written heavier or written lighter, but they're always there. Linda likes always saying, like, Rabbi, dots, what's the story? Which is a good question, because they're probably there to make you ask the question of, there are dots here. Rashi's comment when it says is that the dots are there only to say darsheni, only to say interpret me. That is just sort of like, it's like a highlight or an italics or a bold saying there's something going on here, but they're not going to tell you what. It's just a highlight saying, take note.
Is that like Sela?
Sela in a little way. So Sela in poetic sections, Sela like doesn't appear so much in the Torah, like that's in like Psalms and things like that. And we don't know what it means, but it could mean Sela could mean like, yeah, or similar to like amen, or it could be some of these things could be like musical notations, like adagio or major something. Yeah. So Sela, like sort of an explanation. Okay, so good. So good. I'm gonna repeat the question. So Ed's question was, is that like Sela? Which is how you heard me respond. And Rana's question is, why plural? So God has a couple of names. One is Yud He Vav He. That's one that we traditionally don't write out. So I don't know, but and then the other main name for God in the text, not the only, they're multiple, but the two main ones used in the text are Yud He Vav He and Elohim. Now, in English, most standard English translations, as I say, translate Yud He Vav He as Lord and Elohim as God. And that remains consistent throughout. They're not synonyms in a way. I mean, they're not interchangeable, I should say. God is always the Elohim translation, and Lord is always the Yud He Vav He translation. So they're different things. God is, by the way, what God is, and Yud He Vav He is seen as the name, right? So this is Alan is a man. Man is like the category of thing, and Alan is the name. Yud He Vav He is the name, and Elohim is almost like what God is. There are many gods out there that people worship. This happens to be like the one real one, like in probably to ancient Israelites, but the name So there's a name and a thing. Elohim, why is it plural? The other thing is El means God. Eloheinu is the first person plural possessive form, our God, right? That you're familiar with. Elohim is most commonly used word, but Elohim has the traditional plural at the end, right? Im. So if El is God, then Elohim is like gods. So it seems to be in the plural. So why is that? So on one level, as always, like, we don't know because we don't have like nobody there, like nobody footnoted this stuff in the original, right? So we're not there to say. The possibilities include that you could say that this is a singular word that looks like a plural word, the same way, help me out here, in English there are.
Well, I mean, when you read the Hebrew text for Yom Kippur, it's Yom Kippurim.
Right, so Yom Kippurim is that right? The Day of Atonements.
Yeah.
Sometimes it appears as right. Deer, right? Yeah. So sometimes you have words that function both fish, sheep, deer, moose. So it could be like something in this category. That's one option, like where that's just a unusual grammatical form. Or you could say that this is a some version of the royal we type of thing, like where like because God is so grand and all-encompassing that that the singular doesn't contain, so that they just use the plural. Could be that. Could be, I think, it may have, it likely evolved. They're using, I think the ancient Israelites are using the language that they inherited. Meaning, the Israelites don't appear out of nowhere. They're in a specific cultural context. They're in Canaan. They're in a society where they are living amongst polytheists. So the language that they're speaking reflects the cultural context, the same way if we're speaking in English, it reflects a certain cultural context. And the word that they used for God was Elohim. Their neighbors were using it because it was plural on purpose. But it eventually becomes so it's the word that you use for your gods. And the Israelites essentially, I think, take it on, but don't change the form. Even when they, as it were, like reduce the number of gods from plural to singular, the word remains the same because their language sort of like just kept on the same way other words like are anachronistically part of the language. I have dialed many of your numbers on my cell phone, even though my cell phone doesn't have a rotary dial on it. Right? But we still say dial. Yeah, I have a cheap, and like you can even like, and sometimes it's even called the dialer, right? Like but like there's, and the reason it's called dialer because it used to dial. You did this. But the word is held on. So I think it might be something like that, where they were in a society where where you referred to this stuff as plural, and then times changed, but the word remained. So like we say dial a phone, they said Elohim, they continued with Elohim. I think that's the most likely explanation, that it's just a linguistic holdover from an earlier time, which then presupposes that this is the non-Orthodox part of it, right? That there's a history to the text and a history to the language, and that it emerges out of a certain point in time. And that point in time is that they were polytheists. This is Abraham's story, as it were, and then it becomes something else. So I think that's it. But it is worth noting that Elohim looks like a plural word. Chapter 1 of Genesis will use that word for God, right? Elohim is the name used for God in chapter 1 of Genesis. In chapter 2 of Genesis, the same, or what we've, the God is always referred to as Adonai Elohim, as Yud He Vav He Elohim, back to back. Always, chapter 2 is always that. And later in the text, usually it's just Yud He Vav He, or just Elohim, like one or the other. So the names vary. Yes, but the singular of Elohim is also Elohim. Meaning, so it always takes a singular verb, right? So you can have a singular or plural verb in Hebrew, right? So Elohim, whenever Elohim does something, it's a singular action. So it's clear that they're understanding it as a singular thing. But I think it's reasonable to assume what I said, that it's a word that was a holdover from an earlier time, a vestigial tale of a word, like, and it's like dialing a phone, or we have other ways of doing this. Yeah.
Could this just be lazy editing, because if you accept the theory that two different, multiple authors, when you Yod-Heh Vav-Heh, when you Elohim, and it got together, they're a whole lot of these. I'm not changing them.
Well, no. So I do. So I don't ask, like, is this like reflecting lazy editing? He's also wearing a "Let There Be Light" T-shirt with a scientific formula for light, I'm guessing, in between. No, so I'm rarely going to be on the lazy editing team. I think it's carefully edited. But just like, but again, just like we hold on to certain ways of talking, even after like that, the literal thing isn't like, there are ones other than dial out there that I can think that icebox. Yeah, but no one uses you can still say tune into a program, where you're not really like tuning into a program anymore, or something like that. Like there's lots of I just think that that's the word that gets used. I don't think it's an editing thing, though. But it's like you wouldn't change the name, so it's not that it's lazy editing, because everyone knows this. Everyone knows God by the name Elohim, so you can't change the name because the name is already there. And so El is often like the type of God that God is again, like there are lots of gods out there, uppercase or lowercase g, uppercase or lowercase aleph. Like this. Elohim, by the way, same thing, can be uppercase or lowercase, as it were. Yeah. So lots of translations out there, a lot of good ones. I like Fox, I like Friedman, I like Alter the best. Right. Pause. Other questions? There's no introduction to the Torah. Now, if you buy a copy, there is an introduction, but that's written, in the last couple of years, right? Like so we don't know what's the purpose of the book, especially when you think of where it starts out. Famously, as we'll say, Rashi asks, why does the Torah start here? Like the Torah, it begins with a creation story, and Rashi says, why begin here? You've heard me say this 100 times. Why doesn't the Torah begin with the mitzvot? It should begin in Exodus 12, when the mitzvot for Israel start coming. Rashi will then answer his own question. It doesn't begin with the mitzvot so that you can know that God created everything. And when God assigned the land of Israel to the people of Israel, should somebody say, what gives you the right? Answer, I made it. I can give it to who I want. Right? So that's Rashi's explanation for why it begins there, which is a good and bad explanation. It's good in that it makes clear that you could think, as many Jews do, that the point of the Torah is to tell us what to do. tell me what to do. You know what? If I buy something from IKEA, I want instructions that tell me what to do or show me what to do. I don't want a long explanation of how this came to be and what the designer was feeling when designing the bookcase. I just want instructions on what to do. There are Jews who look at the Torah this way. Just tell me what to do. The Torah, of course, isn't that way. It goes through this long explanation of like before telling you what to do. It's not just a book of instructions. It seems to be something else. And that something else is might be, how are we supposed to live our lives? And that's sort of the question that's there. And that's almost why it's written this way. So there's strange editing and strange wording, but that's what makes it the Torah, meaning that if it were obvious, you could read it once and put it aside like any other book. The fact that its meaning isn't clear is what makes it possible to come back year after year. So what seems like a weakness is in fact its strength, one of its strengths. Does that make sense? Like, so that back when it was a bigger thing and there were like a handful of prominent public intellectual atheists who would like to debate with non-atheists, religious people. Dennett and Christopher Hitchens would do this, and Sam Harris, and what's his name? Who wrote Dawkins, and Sam Harris, who wrote books on like on why religion is stupid. Not paraphrasing. Would say like, ugh, this book is horrible. There's genocide. I could write a better book than this. But weirdly, he didn't. Like people think they can write a better book than this, but in fact, like nobody writes a book that people keep coming back to year after year, which if you're capable of, it'd be worth doing because you can make a lot of money at it and influence the world for the better. Like, so the weird things about it are what makes it what it is. That's enough of an introduction. That's enough of an introduction. All right then. So,
Year put department.
pardon me?
The year put department.
The year put departments. Oh, what year is this written, as it were? So, the short answer is, as always, we don't know. Our options are, if you want to go with Moses, the time of Moses in the Exodus is like 1200, 1300 BCE, right? So, 3,400 years ago, something like this. That's the time of Moses. So if you want to go with a traditional dating, it's that. The scholars who try to date these things also put down a range. There are debates on this. There's some consensus, though again, like it's a debated thing, that it's in its current form upon the return from the exile in Babylon, which is to say, if the temple is destroyed in 586 and the return is like 514 BCE, and shortly after that, there's a scene in Ezra. Ezra reads the Torah to the people, and in the book of Ezra. And the general assumption is the Torah that Ezra is reading to the people is the Torah that we have. And that the latest part of the Torah to be written, as it were, is what we encountered late in the book of Kings. If you remember, late in the book of Kings, there was a scene in the time of King Josiah. King Josiah finally gets all the idols out of the temple and kicks out the corrupt priests and gets rid of the idolatry. And there's a whole cleaning of the temple to make sure that everything is kosher and all the non-kosher sacrifices are out. And in cleaning out the temple from all the bad stuff, they find one of the books of Moses that they had lost, and that they saw that they were doing so many things wrong, and that they had to repent and start doing things the way it hadn't been done since the time of Joshua, hundreds and hundreds of years earlier. So this is one of the great scenes in the book of Kings, 2 Kings towards the end, and chapter 20, whatever. And and most assume that that's the book of Deuteronomy. That what they discover in the temple is Deuteronomy, which they say, we found this, but in fact is like written at that time before the exile. So in the 600s BCE, Deuteronomy has a sort of consistent style throughout, though there may be like multiple authors there, and that Deuteronomy combined with priestly teachings that were attributed to the time of Moses, along with the northern traditions of the history of the people of Israel, which are known as the E source. Because the first word for God that they use there is Elohim. And the southern traditions of the history of the people of Israel, which are known as the J source, because when this theory was hatched, they were doing it in Germany, and Yud He Vav He, the Yah of God's name, the Yud, obviously in German is transcribed as a J. That the northern traditions, the E source, reflecting northern Israel's concerns, referring to God most commonly or initially as Elohim. The J source, reflecting the southern traditions, and which consistently calls God by Yud He Vav He. The E source does as well, but it initially uses Elohim. The P source, which reflects priestly concerns, the book of Leviticus, all of those skin diseases and things like that, also the first chapter. And the D source, Deuteronomy, are all combined by the redactor, or R source, who stitches all of these things together, takes the northern history, E, takes the southern history, J, takes the priestly sources, P, and stitches them all together with the redactor does, R, with like editorial comments, and sort of like shuffles them together into a deck, and puts in connecting words and like puts the stories next to each other and things like this, and then puts D, Deuteronomy, onto the end, and that makes the Torah, and that's in something like the final form before the exile, 586 BCE, but is in its final form certainly after the exile, might come into its current form during the exile, when R, the redactor, is like, well, we got to make sure we got this stuff down so we don't lose it now that we're going through tough times. So like the scholarly assumption is somewhere in the 6th century BCE, it comes into its current form. You can find some scholars who say later than that, though it's hard for them to make that argument, I think, because everyone seems to have moved on by the time of Ezra. Earlier than that, it's hard to do, because also like that story in Kings sort of like is pretty obvious. And every so often there are references in the Torah that indicate that the editor knows what happened after the time of Moses, right? So you know, if there's a reference to an Acura, you know, this wasn't written in the 18th century, right? So every so often, you have to read closely, but every so often there's a reference to an Acura, meaning that you sort of like know that the Torah isn't being written in the time of Moses, or at the very least, somebody like went back in and like stitched it in, an anachronism. So 6th century BC, and I actually do think that. I think that by the 6th century BCE, around the time of Ezra, that something very, very closely related to what we have in the Ark was extant, and that's what they were reading, that they thought of it as the Torah at that point in time. And it can't be any later than the 2nd century BCE, because the Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Torah, of the whole Bible, from the Hebrew comes into being in the 2nd century BCE, and we have it, like, and we have the translations, and it looks a lot like what we have here, with like minor differences here and there, but it's like translator differences. It's the same thing that we talk about, like where like translators explain things. It's like the story's the same, but like they fill in a couple of the blanks. So it was the Torah by then, by the 2nd century. It just probably was the 6th century. That. All right. So next time we will actually read the Torah. Yes. But all this, I don't know, I feel like it's part of the background that one should have. Like the and the idea is that the cool about that, you turn it over because everything is in it, and I think it's going to be fun, and I think it's like a leaping off point for everything else.
There's always thing always has to be great. If God always was, what was he doing before Bereshit?
What's God doing before Beresheet? We are going to address that question